Hello and welcome to Events as a Pipeline to Building Stronger Communities with Greg Oates. This is a new episode of the Event Manager podcast. My name is Miguel Neves and I'm the editor-in-chief of EventMB, and I'm joined by Dylan Monorchio in speaking to Greg Oates, the Senior Vice President of Innovation at MMGY Next Factor. On this episode, we talk about how events are a pipeline to support the priorities of the destination, how the pandemic has increased the visibility of DMOs to different parts of government. We talk about the big shifts in intention coming out of COVID on the part of event planners and people who book events and destinations. How association executives are actively selecting destinations with positive DEI reputation. We talk about the ongoing challenges of working with board members. We talk about how hybrid events remain unknown across the industry. We also talk about how to define and measure destination performance. And last but not least, we talk about the constant need for great storytelling in destination marketing. I hope you enjoy this episode, and don't forget to rate us and leave a review, please. Thank you very much.
Now for a word from our sponsors, PHL Life Sciences, a division of the Philadelphia Convention and Visitors Bureau. Host your convention or trade show in Philadelphia, one of America's leading life sciences hubs. PHL Life Sciences, the first and only CVB division of its kind, will connect you to the professionals at the forefront of your industry and to a culture you can only find in Philadelphia, a city known for its rich history that's forging a bright future. Philadelphia challenges the expected and defies convention. A world of discovery is waiting. Visit phllife.com to learn more.
Hello, everyone. Miguel Neves here, and I am delighted to be joined by Greg Oates today. Greg is a past contributor to Skift. With me today is also Dylan Monorchio, the deputy editor of EventMB. But Greg, really nice to have you with us today. Thank you for being on the podcast. I'm looking forward to this episode already.
Likewise. Thanks for inviting me in, Miguel.
Perfect. So you're the Senior Vice President of Innovation at MMGY Next Factor, which is part of MMGY Global, and you work with cities to align government, community, and industry priorities to drive overall destination performance, competitiveness, and brand. There's some big words in there. Could you maybe just decode that a little bit to make sure we all understand, what you do and what MMGY Next Factor does?
Right, sure. So we're a consultancy that works with destination organizations, tourism boards, convention bureaus worldwide. And I guess most of the work we do is around strategic planning, short, medium, and long term, really to help destinations optimize the interactions between their visitors, the industry that serves them, whether it's meetings or leisure, the communities that host them, and the built-in natural environment, and really looking not at tourism or at meetings, but just the interaction between local and global communities, and thinking about the visitor industry as a platform for community building for any destination, and just really aligning all of those different segments and audiences more effectively to build better cities. So that's in a nutshell.
Now, there's some pretty lofty goals there and some, pretty important things that you're doing. So, it's been a tough time for destinations. We're recording this episode in early July 2021. It's looking pretty good in a lot of parts of the US in terms of the leisure, and in terms of travel and vaccination kind of status is looking pretty good. But it's not been an easy 16 months or so. And I'm guessing for destination marketing, it's really not been an easy time. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe if there's any kind of silver lining when you talk about these big picture goals that you could talk about?
Well, let's just go back and unpack what you said about these being big, lofty goals. And anything that we do is built on just extensive engagement with the industry and research. And, when we look back at, say, like a Holland or a lot of countries in Northern Europe or Australia, they've been having this conversation for half a dozen or more years, the idea that tourism, quote unquote, meetings, events, visitor volume isn't the end goal. It's a pipeline to support the priorities of the city. So when we talk about this, these conversations have been happening for a long time. What's happened because of COVID, I think, is there's a lot more awareness and intention around some of these lofty ideas, which aren't necessarily that lofty, and that these ideas are now scaling worldwide. And so destinations of all sizes are now rethinking how the visitor economy can benefit a wider breadth of stakeholders and residents and organizations in any city. So coming out of COVID, there's a lot more awareness about this. And there's really quite a few, let's say, silver linings, as you say, but just some of the high points here. Government, community, and industry leaders are more aligned like they've ever been before around how the government can support attracting meetings and events and supporting stakeholders. Paul Mokry, the city manager in Vancouver, told me a couple of weeks ago, he said, we never really cared about tourism in Vancouver or the visitor industry because we thought that was all looked after. He said COVID completely turned that on its head. Jeff Miller, CEO for Portland, said, I've talked with government leaders more in the last couple of months than I have in my 10 years here. So that would be one example. There's others as well, but I think just more awareness.
Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more? So what I'm hearing is you're saying that it's a pretty emergency dire situation, and destinations, a lot of destinations are realizing that the business travel, or at least the event side of business travel, doesn't just happen, right? And there is a sort of need for things to be taken care of. And I think in a good year, or in a relatively normal year, it does happen, but there's still activities, right? There's still marketing activities. There's still things happening that really help to move these things on. So do you feel that destinations or destination marketing organizations are making a better case for themselves in a way because people have realized how important it is to keep that flow going?
I think COVID did it for them. And now governments say, okay, we do need to pay attention, and understanding that to attract meetings and events and to attract higher value meetings and events is a destination-wide initiative. And the public, private, and civic sectors, the more that they can work together more effectively, the more attractive they are to decision makers on the buyer side. So when we worked with ICA to develop their caching protocol coming out of the Taiwan conference last December, we spoke with international buyers, and it was very much that we need a lot more information than we've been getting in the past. We want to not just know what's happening in the destination, but all of the assets that you can pull together and expertise beyond your borders, and how the government wants to support this, and how all of your community organizations and nonprofits and foundations and universities can also be involved in this. COVID made that story a lot easier to sell to partners beyond the industry.
So I guess it's a silver lining, kind of an indirect silver lining almost. It's like, well, now you realize how much you miss us when you don't have us, is kind of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. We work with boards all the time, and a board member for a large first-tier city in North America on a one-on-one call said, we're not respected by any level of government. And how do we change that? And that's been the constant lament of the industry for decades? But there's now sort of a hole's been punched in that whole dialogue, because, like you say, without the industry, now the industry is more visible than ever in destinations.
Interesting. No, that's good. So tell me about other silver linings that you're seeing. I mean, is that the sort of broader one, or are there other kind of broad ones that you think were silver linings for this period?
I think destination organizations are much more aware of the need to engage a broader breadth of stakeholders beyond the big assets, the convention centers and the big hotels and the airports, and to start looking at how they can bring more people in the community into the entire process to secure meetings and events. That would be one in terms of the industry. I think for the actual, on the buyer side, another maybe takeaway or silver lining is that they're driving home the message that industry needs to be much more flexible. So we start talking about shared risks and contracts, at least in the next 6 to 18 months, potentially longer. And now destinations are starting to listen to what buyers have been talking about for so long around shared risks. So that's a conversation that's improving and moving forward.
Do you unpack that a little bit more, the shared risk model? How does that work in practice? And I think, from the planner perspective, what does that mean?
Right. So if, with everything being so fluid now and planners starting to book events or starting to have conversations about booking events, and again, everything is so fluid right now, they're looking for flexibility in contract negotiations. And the feedback we've been hearing is sometimes hotels and destinations are flexible, sometimes they're not. Where we've seen a good case study might be like Toronto, where they've brought together, I think it's like 28 hotels. They brought together logistics providers. They've basically packaged the city with all of the relevant stakeholders. And part of that package is flexibility in contract negotiations and attrition, all of those different pieces. And that if you don't, meet your expected volumes, then we will work with you on that. So just trying to share the risk, because there's so much risk right now in trying to put together any size event. That would be one example, I think, of a destination that's actually being intentional and upfront about, here's our city and here's how we're going to work with you. And the feedback we're getting from planners is that's something that they're looking for now more than ever.
Do you think that that's something that might persist in the long term, or is that mostly just a reaction to the level of uncertainty and risk now that they're kind of accommodating because they have to in order to win some kind of business, but otherwise?
It's absolutely, a reaction to what's happening now, to be flexible and fluid. Long term, who's to say? Demand for meetings is obviously going to increase over the next few years. Will that willingness to share risk continue? That's hard to say, but based on the framework coming out of Koshan with ICA, that was one of 4 sort of key priorities to look at for the long term, based on what planners are asking. But how will that play out in different cities? It's hard to say.
It does sound to me like a good reason to use a DMO, because I am seeing lots of even relatively large events just bypassing DMOs completely and not really wanting to do with them. But if there's some sort of insurance against, hey, if our event can't go ahead, or if the numbers aren't quite right, and there's a sort of citywide risk sharing, that seems to me like a no-brainer. That then a really good selling point for DMOs in many cases.
Right. And then I just wonder, what is the real influence of a DMO to be a player in that conversation long term? So yes, if they can actually impact that and influence that, then by all means, that's something that's attractive. But I think there's also other things that are coming out of COVID that do provide DMOs with an opportunity to be more influential and necessary in the whole event development process. And it was interesting. We were working with Tourism Vancouver to completely evolve their mandate, and they've just announced, I think it was last week, the shift into Destination Vancouver and what that means being a more sort of destination-wide, community-centric organization. But we did a number of focus groups, and one of them was with US and Canada association planners and decision makers. So these are all pretty serious people with significant influence on site selection. And we asked for their big needs coming out of COVID. And there was a variety, but number one was diversity, equity, inclusion. And that the organization could show how, if they won the event and they developed the event, that they would be more equitable and support, a wider spectrum of vendors and players. And being on that focus group with the CEO, Roy Schwinn, we were both pretty much surprised that was the number one thing. We asked why, and they just says that's what they're getting from all of their stakeholders and participants and sponsors, that has to be transparent and that has to be proven up front around the whole strategy to be more equitable. So that's something absolutely where a DMO can be involved in that process, if, as these association leaders are saying, has become more and more critical priority for how they choose destinations as well.
That's really interesting. I think it's one of those topics we hear a lot of theoretical things, but it's really interesting to hear that from a much more practical perspective. Like, this is what our community is asking for, and I think what you're saying is these associations are going to go to destinations that have DEI priorities, that have a structure that are perceived to be positive in that space.
Well, now we're getting into a bigger conversation too, which is interesting. And what is we talk with boards and we talk about everything happening in sustainability and diversity, and you see sort of a lot of blank faces. It's like, well, why are we getting involved in this? Is this part of our mandate? What's the long-term business case for diversity and sustainability? I have a hotel. I'm a board member with this organization and I'm looking at 20% occupancy. Am I really going to be focused on what you're talking about? And so we go round and round with all these big themes. And I think the 4 big themes, just in general, with relation to the visitor economy and destination organizations coming out of COVID, it's diversity, sustainability, community, and purpose. But going back to the diversity or the sustainability pieces, and diversity sort of falls under sustainability, it's not so much that as an attendee, I'm going to be excited about your destination because the hotels are doing something with gray water, or the fact that a specific diversity initiative that you're doing is going to make me want to host a meeting in your destination or as an attendee visit. It's more just collectively all of these big themes pulling together, and just to have to really share a progressive mindset that the community and that the industry has about making communities stronger and more equitable and more sustainable. It's just that it's that mindset. And so now you look at everything that's coming out of the Helsinkis and Oslos and Gothenburgs that are really fresh conversations. They're all talking about diversity, sustainability, community, and purpose, but not in those words necessarily, but just in their willingness as communities to come out of COVID and say, look, we've gone through this, and these are the things that we're doing to make our world a better place. That can sound trite, but if that's going to be engaging the next generation of attendees, then that's serious business development. So it's trying to identify the business case for progressive mindsets. And that's another shift coming out of COVID. I think pre-COVID, and by the way, the industry wasn't exactly perfect working order before COVID. There were a lot of challenges. But what do we talk about in terms of innovation pre-COVID and going back the last decade? Farm to table, event tech, festivalization of meetings. It feels like, based on all the conversations we're having coming out of COVID, it's going to be on these new themes of sustainability, diversity, purpose, and community, and that these things that used to get us really, really excited are now just kind of table stakes.
Interesting. Really fascinating.
Cool.
Go ahead, Phil.
I was just going to say, to what extent do you think that, you mentioned that the claims, especially in the context of having come out of the pandemic, are somewhat trite, but I wonder if the function as a criterion is being perpetuated in some way by the fact that we're still in a pandemic and a lot of destinations don't have the standard safety claims that they can make in order to, whereas a lot of destinations were advertising on the grounds of being COVID safe going forward and all their new initiatives and all the things that they were putting in place. In many places, those initiatives are kind of falling to the wayside because either, vaccine rollouts and recovery in general are taking place. And so, decisions are being made less crucially based on those COVID factors, or some destinations are just not competitive when it comes to COVID safety. Are they trying to divert the conversation from COVID and COVID safety and the pandemic to those other things because those are things that they can action?
No, I think with regard to cleanliness and hygiene and safety, it just vacillates widely among every destination. So, I'm based in Vegas, and the new Raiders Stadium, Allegiant Stadium, just hosted a concert for, I don't know, there's 20,000 plus people. Garth Brooks is playing this weekend and it's sold out. I mean, this is a massive stadium. Whereas, with clients in Canada, there's still a huge concern over people coming to the city or the resort town with so many concerns about the virus or the pandemic still. When I spoke with Japan, the convention bureau there, they were saying that health, safety, hygiene will be the number one priority for the country's tourism strategy for the long-term future. It's just so all over the place. It's really hard to say. We work with Hilton Head. Their January numbers in 21 were higher during the height of COVID than before COVID. So, there's also the actual consumer who's determining a lot of this and care differently from one segment to the next. So it's hard to pinpoint any sort of cohesive commonality in terms of how destinations are dealing with that.
Are you seeing vaccine rollouts play any role in terms of destinations' eligibility to host, especially international events, or their disposition to do that?
Not anything specific, and it's not a huge focus of ours right now because all the work that we're doing with organization is focused on that next sort of 6 to 18 months looking out, and the destination's already looked after all of that or not. And anything that we say or do isn't going to, I think, impact that to any large degree. And speaking with, the people who plan meetings and decide where to host them, that hasn't been a conversation that's really been high level. I don't know, maybe that's just with us and who we've been speaking to. It's much more on how do you monetize hybrid meetings. Those are the kind of concerns that are front and center versus is a destination safe? Because I feel like most large destinations anyway have those protocols in place.
Well, yeah, I mean, that totally makes sense. I was asking in part because you were talking about how, there was a lot of top-down alignment from governments and other community agencies, and there was a lot more sort of respect for what the destination's pipeline did to serve the destination specifically. So I was thinking that it might be the case that destinations that felt like their own communities were more protected might be more inclined to host international events because, vaccination status is relevant to the level of impact that an international event could have if it turns out to be something that introduces variants or, a new outbreak. But apart from that, I'm curious to know how, whether, given that, as you said, most of the larger destinations are also the ones that have made significant progress when it comes to the pandemic, especially within the American market and how well it's doing in terms of its vaccine rollout. Are you seeing sort of a widening gulf between first tier and second tier destinations based on their sort of eligibility for reopening?
No, I think it's much more of a north-south divide, and we can get into politics and all of that. But throughout COVID, we were traveling a lot through the southern states, just because of those cities had decided that it was safe to open, and we were traveling through so many different places throughout 2020. So yeah, I don't think I could make a distinction between mid-sized cities and the larger cities that way. I think the difference we're seeing between large and mid-sized cities is really airlift capacity, and that it's even more difficult now for the smaller cities to sell meetings and events when airlift is such an unknown. Right now, at least in the short term, I think that would be more how we would look at differentiating larger and smaller markets.
Okay, and I assume that also applies outside of the States, like in terms of primary markets within the States compared to other perhaps European or other markets.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, that makes sense.
Are you ready to celebrate your successes in the world of meetings and events? The Skift Meetings Awards are back for 2024, recognizing the most innovative business events companies across 15 categories, and we want you to be a part of it. Winners will feature on Skift Meetings, sending a clear signal to events professionals around the world that these are partners they can rely on. The final deadline for submissions is June 11th. We encourage you to start your submission today to secure the best entry rates. For more information and to start your submission, head to live.skift.com.
So, Greg, wanted to touch on this question of the challenge, boards being a challenge. You touched on that a little bit before, and was wondering if you could expand on that. And I think this is something you're quite passionate about.
Yeah, passionate about and overwhelmed with at times. And but this is something I talk a lot about. So if we're looking for how the industry is going to transform coming out of COVID, and we talked about some of the significant shifts that we see, and this idea that the visitor economy isn't an end goal in itself, and it's really a pipeline for building stronger communities, towns, cities, etc. All that sounds good, and the destination organizations are on board, and they want to be more impactful and relevant in their communities, and the communities are of course on board to spread and optimize the benefits of the visitor economy in their cities. But when you get to the boards, that's where we often run up against a big wall. And board members, run the gamut. There are some that are really embrace the need for change and innovation and evolving the mandates of the organization. But there's also that strong cohort of board members that say, look, my hotel's a 20% occupancy. We need to drive visitor volumes above all else. Every single dollar should be spent, buying ads on Expedia. And both are right in different ways, but what we're seeing now more coming out of this is that boards are more, oftentimes, there's a lot more polarity in terms of everyone's agendas, and you're dealing now, and you always have, but even more so with these different politics and personalities and power structures that are all vying for their sort of domain within the community. So that's where, when we talk about these themes, diversity, sustainable, community, purpose, all that, we have to present really a business case, a long-term business case, and not necessarily in pure dollars, but to validate why it's important for the organization to go in this direction, because that's how organizations are speaking to travelers, whether it's meetings or leisure. So not that we have a lot of answers, but it takes a lot of work to identify why. We talk about trends and strategies, but we have to come up with the case studies to show about how this benefited the bottom line in destinations globally. And this isn't easy, but trying to find case studies like that or identify why destinations went in this direction to support decision-making at the board level is something that is, we're pretty preoccupied with these days.
And I get the sense that you're finding it much harder to work with boards now. Is that what you're finding? Yeah,
because again, no one really has answers. When we were doing the ECA project, and we were talking with, like, as the head of the head of knee surgery, something like that, with a large event that was going to Milan. And she said, what scares me most is no one has any answers right now coming out of COVID and the shift or the expansion to hybrids. So navigating that, how do we speak to boards in an educated way based on all of our experience, but without a lot of case studies based on some of these new themes and ideas and how they benefit the destination? We have those, but how we talk about them and share them and expand on them is absolutely more of a challenge coming out of COVID, just like anything else an organization is dealing with, when everything's been completely turned on its head, so to speak.
So one of the things you also touched a bit on, and it's part of kind of your job description and what you do, is this idea of brand and destination performance. And I imagine this is quite important to prove, or at least demonstrate to boards and other kind of higher up positions. How do you define that? Like, how do you measure that, and how do you link that back to the work that you do with destinations?
So this isn't necessarily a new conversation, but it's a conversation that most organizations aren't focused on. But if you look at the World Economic Forum Travel and Tourism Index that comes out of every 2 years, they rank the competitiveness, this is at the national level, globally. And all of these indicators are based on community well-being and diversity and sustainability and all these conversations that we're having. So there's actually a template for showing how the healthier and stronger that a community is, the more that helps a destination's competitiveness in the visitor industry. We're now trying to take all those ideas and make them much more approachable and easier to understand at the board and the management level. So if we're, say, working with Vancouver again, I'll just use some of these more recent examples because case studies are so important. This is a city that has the lowest carbon impact output per resident in North America. It was the first city of reconciliation to work with Indigenous First Nations communities, both in the city and across the country. Richmond, a suburb, is, Harbour Air is developing the first commercial electric powered planes. They have electric powered ferries going over to Vancouver Island. Greenpeace was there. So anyway, there's this legacy of all of these things we're talking about going back decades that Vancouver has embraced and has supported. It speaks to what the city is about. But yet they don't have that brand narrative to sell and to really promote to meeting planners. So speaking with the head of the board and trade there a couple of weeks ago, she said, we don't really have a brand narrative for the city of Vancouver. We need the whole city to come together, public, private, and civic sectors, to define what this city is. And it should be positioned as kind of maybe a Scandinavia of North America, because we have all those pieces there. So now you have this brand narrative piece, which has often been the province of the destination organization. But coming out of this, it's really like the Vancouver example, where you have to have everyone talking together to define what they're really about. And Elke Dens, the CMO in Flanders, said it's not about being known anymore. It's about being known for something. And she actually used Austin as an example, which I thought was interesting for a European to look to Austin that way. So, you look at Denmark, who has done it well and provides a case, I think, for Vancouver. There's the State of Green, right? Denmark's national campaign to promote expertise in clean technology, green, what have you, which they commercialize and export, and they attract meetings and events based on that expertise. And so that's what we mean by destination performance. If a city like Vancouver can pull together all of what it's doing and actually base the brand narrative in that, and bring the community all together around all of these ideas to work together more effectively to drive destination performance, then there is that clear business case for all of these new themes coming together. So that's sort of a roundabout way in terms of getting there.
It's a bit of a complex issue, but let me ask you something in terms of the work from the sort of meetings and events perspective. It sounds like a lot of this is destination perspective, perception. If a destination is perceived in a certain way globally, then it has that attraction for meetings and events. Is there a sort of, in your mind, a specific positioning that is only for meetings and events, or for the kind of B2B side of things? Or is it just the perception of the destination that has this effect?
So we've done a lot of research on this, and the answer is both. But specific to, from the meeting side, there's still an interest in how a brand positions itself that would be of interest to the leisure as well. Walkability, bikeability, getting around, culture, food, all of that. But specific to the meeting side is how a destination can present itself as a place where everyone in the community has an opportunity to participate in the process of bringing a meeting to a destination. And that if I go to a destination at a conference, I'll be able to explore and see and experience how this destination is really creating better communities and creating better cities. I'm trying to stay away from the whole change the world thing, right? MPI used to do that, and I thought it was great, right? MPI said, when we meet, we change the world. And then they sort of shied away from that. And, you bring that up to a board of directors, hey, we want to change the world, and they'll ask you to leave. But that's really what we're talking about. And just quickly, you look at Scotland's whole new initiative, right? Journey to Change, and what they came out and partnering with the Wellbeing Alliance. That's exactly what they're talking about. And you look at their communications, and it's saying, you come to Scotland, this is where the brightest minds in the world want to talk about the biggest issues of the day. To me, it's like, I want to go to Scotland now. I want to be part of that mindset that's there. And you look at Destination DC and the connected capital, and we're not just going to connect you with everything in DC, we're going to connect you with, the world in terms of whatever your sector expertise is. And we, have that will, that intention, and the ability to do that.
So access to intellectual capital.
Well, and then again, you got to, but it's also the creative industries. It's just, we've talked about that for years, and it's phenomenal how that's evolving. There's that intellectual capital piece, but there's also that creative capital, and how leveraging your creative economy and your creative industries and your makers. So expanding that idea from intellectual capital to any kind of creator who has something to say and can contribute to a meeting event, whether that's within the meeting or outside. But yes, based on that idea, selling brain power versus selling buildings.
How does hybrid impact the import of intellectual capital in a given destination, considering that they can now bring in speakers from anywhere, and it's kind of become sort of mainstream or commonplace to broadcast that virtually?
Well,
and to consume it virtually.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? First of all, there's so much pushback against hybrid from within the industry, especially the big asset owners, because it scares the bejesus out of them. It's as if it's going to, we're having the same conversation about digital cannibalizing face-to-face. And maybe there's more to that coming out of COVID because of remote work, and everyone's adopted Zoom, and now do you need to fly across the ocean for a one-day meeting to sell something when you can potentially do that? So that will impact visitor volumes overall. But in terms of hybrid, and this is where, speaking again with planners that we did for the eco work, where they want to know how a destination can bring a much wider breadth of expertise to an event versus just what's within their borders. And that's when we're starting to speak about the hybrid piece. But then there's the pushback, well, this is too expensive, and all the tech concerns, and those are true right now, but the technology is going to continue to improve. But the idea is, how can you bring a wider breadth of expertise to any individual event? And you've seen, also the idea of regional events. Germany's been playing with this. Moving On Summit, which is developed by the people behind C2 Montreal, hosted another regional event, and I think it was in Paris, Singapore, and Montreal. So we're getting much better at pulling all the expertise at any given moment by bringing the world together into a single space. There's just so much concerns around cost now, and ROI, and what that looks like in terms of how events will play out. And there's still so much testing going on, but you can see where a lot are investing in that area. The new Palais de Congrès at Montreal, what they're doing in terms of converting their entire space into basically a digital box. You look at BOCOM and everything German Convention Bureau is doing. And then even someone like Long Beach, which has the whole Long Beach Live District, they've basically taken their entire convention center district and they're turning it into a hybrid platform, and they have the sales and the messaging behind all that. So that's clearly where things are going. And the idea is that it expands the exposure for any one given event. But when you talk about this, it makes asset owners and hotel owners very, very anxious. So again, something we're trying to navigate through. And again, where we need the business model for hybrid. We're all talking about it, but there's not a lot of people sharing successful business models about what this looks like when it's done well.
But it sounds like it's fair to say that there's something of a shift from the promise of intellectual capital to now destinations building up the infrastructure for being able to capitalize on the intellectual capital elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're destinations have been pooling all of their expertise in advanced industries and selling that. So the natural progression now with the advancement in hybrid technologies is how can you bring more people from around the world aligned with those specific topics? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then how can destinations sell that and package that and show that capability in real world terms?
Well, I imagine it's easier for larger destinations than smaller second-tier destinations.
In that regard, although you look like an Albuquerque, which has 3 federal labs, around the city, the Sandia, Los Alamos, and the Air Force National Lab, and the innovation coming out of there is insane. And so they very much shifted toward that intellectual capital as well to commercialize all the things coming out of those labs. So we talked with Cambridge and some university towns across Europe as well, where they're very much going in that direction. But yes, and then what is a large first tier city? If you look at a Fort Worth, which typically wouldn't be considered in that realm, very much working with Texas A&M and what's evolving there, and they're home to American Airlines and Bell Helicopters, and they have the largest medical cluster in the state. So they're very much now starting to focus on how to leverage that to attract events in those sectors where they typically hadn't before. So there's still a lot of movement in there. It's not just all the global capitals.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions that I had for you was really this idea of, can all cities or destinations aspire to really strategically shape their economy or societies through tourism? And I think you're kind of saying that everyone can, but you need to find what makes them unique, or you need to find them what is most interesting about them. Is that how you start with this approach, or that's where you would start for any destination that wants to kind of approach that?
Yes, and to what you said, coming up with the language to explain that, to get buy-in across the power structures in any given city, to show the reason behind some of these new ways of thinking, and not to try and be too transformational, but sometimes just to move the needle in a way, saying that there's all this money coming into your destination. How can you optimize that spend and expand it and diversify it and help more people in the community benefit from that? And so you could look at this just as a basic visitor dispersal strategy to get people to spend more money in more different places. But when you start talking with community organizations and government and understanding some of the neighborhood development needs, definitely equity, diversity, and inclusion needs there, then really any destination can manage that visitor flow and the dollar spending more effectively to align with some of those community needs. And the idea is that ultimately, by leveraging the visitor economy to build stronger communities, you have a more interesting community to market and promote and sell. If you're collaborating with all the other organizations, public and private, in the city to build a more interesting destination, then ultimately that's going to give you more interesting stories to tell and to sell. So it's kind of this circular constant feedback loop where really ultimately you are driving more engagement with travelers and attracting them to your destination because you have a more interesting story to tell. Like, we can't just keep talking about farm to table on the leisure side and, nice hotels and renovated meeting space on the event side. We we need to come up with new stories, and there's clearly a demand from audiences for those kinds of stories.
You make it sound so simple, but you're also kind of saying that a lot of destinations don't do this, right? So it's that finding the right stories to tell is sounds like it's the key to a lot of this.
Yeah, like I go back to that Scotland, like that really resonated with me, and I want to know more about that. You look at Oslo, getting rid of cars in their downtown, and Helsinki talking about, their new freedom campaign. You're free to be the person you want here. Like, these are ideas that now make me look at these cities more intentionally. And do I want to go to that event? I'm talking about it as an attendee. There's people in these destinations that are doing some amazing things. I want to meet them, whether I'm on the buyer supplier, the supplier side. I want to have these conversations. And one thing we talk about with Canadian clients is that there's very little in Canada that the US doesn't have, for the most part. So it has to be about ideas. It has to be about something that's going to inspire you as whatever kind of person within the industry to look at that destination in a new way. And that all sounds good. It does sound easy, but we look to the Helsinkis and Oslos and Gothenburgs and Singapores and Sydneys of the world who are already doing this. And as well, not just those, there's Carson Valley, which is just south of Tahoe. They have a budget of $800,000, but they have a whole Legends campaign that's showing interesting people in the destination and how they're trying to build a better community. You have the Wild Women campaign for Jackson Hole, which is absolutely phenomenal, which is showing that Wyoming, I think, was the first to elect female legislators back in the 20s. There's this legacy of progressive ideals and values in that sense around gender equality. And they're showing now the Olympic skier and the governor and the beer maker and the barrel racer and all these women that are pretty cool, looks like anyway, people. And this is something that our community stands for. And we want to help build the future with you. Now that might sound, again, I don't know, that resonates to different people in different ways, but I've shown those videos probably to 100 different boards, and it's going to be in the next presentation of Destinations International Annual next week. So I'm sharing it with everyone I can. I'm sharing it with you. So there is precedent for this. We're just trying to bottle it and package it and connect the dots and be able to show this is what's happening, this is why, and this is why you should think about it. And if you're that hotel GM who's only thinking about, your next quarter results, as you should be, 100%. I'm not here to disparage any board members, but there's also a longer term play that's going to benefit your organization, your company, your product or asset in the long term. And we need to be thinking about that too, while we're focused on your next quarter results.
Yep. I think you said a lot there in terms of the power of content marketing and the power of telling great stories. So definitely a fan of that as well.
But just to catch on that, the difference now is that coming out of COVID, we've been talking the talk. Now it's time to walk the walk. And if you're going to be having these stories about diversity, sustainability, community, purpose, all that, then the DMO really has to be invested in product and destination development to make that real and to deliver.
Yeah, you can't just make up stories and there not be any substance, right? You have to help uncover those stories and make them interesting.
Yeah, so just moreover, if you are going to use a story as part of your marketing campaign, you have to make it accessible as a theme for an event and actually furnish the event planner with, activations and locations and cuisine and things like that reinforce what it is you're trying to sell. You can't just leave it up to them to find those things at the destination once they get there.
But also just in terms of product and destination development, you actually have to help be part of the process to develop those types of experiences and those types of organizations and products. So that I think is a big shift too. And this is absolutely on the meeting side where the DMOs are being more intentional in product development to help create some of these things in order to tell stories about them. And I would go back to that Vancouver focus group with the Canadian American buyers. Their number one need, their number one want from any city is what they're doing in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. And Royce and I sitting there really? And then they just went off. Yeah, absolutely. This is what we're getting from from our sides, we absolutely have to be transparent and show how our meeting is going to be a pipeline for improving this in any given destination. I mean, that's a transformational shift for sure.
Yeah, that to me sounds like boards and other important people within organizations are more aware than ever of the spending power and the business that those types of events generate, and they want to place those carefully. They don't just want to splash it out in the nicest hotel or the nicest food, right? They want to be able to make a difference. So, I mean, that's really really nice to hear that that's actually happening and kind of going through the ranks in some sense.
And that presents that business case, because when we started this conversation, we talked about Holland's, it was their 2030 perspective in 2015. They're the ones that really came out with the idea that tourism isn't the end goal. It's a pipeline to build stronger communities. Now, with this feedback from, American and Canadian buyers in that Vancouver focus group, now there's the business case to show that, look, this isn't a nice to have, but this is what's determining site selection moving forward. So, the destination needs to get on board, and you need to be on board with that, because that's how people are deciding how to spend money now.
Fantastic, Greg. I think that was a fascinating conversation. We're going to wrap up there, but I really appreciate you being on the podcast. One last thing I wanted to ask you, and we ask this to all our guests. It's always good to get recommendations on who we should have on the podcast next. So would love to get a recommendation from you.
Yeah, so I thought about this a lot. I like Jeff Miller, the CEO of Travel Portland. We looked at Portland a lot. He's the one that told me years ago, actually it was in a skiff story, we don't focus on farm to table, sustainability, biking, all these new age themes anymore, because we invented that 20 years ago. We focus on our makers, the people, the creators in our community who define what Portland means on a hyper-local level. On that street corner is our differentiator. And that goes back to community values and progressive mindsets and all of that. But they got hit really hard with BLM, right? And all of a sudden Portland was looking at itself, and the rules in Portland, well, you're not all as nice and progressive as you thought. It is actually happening nationwide in Canada. COVID has, and some of these and things like BLM have really put a mirror up to a lot of communities. And Jeff in Portland has had to navigate that. Their new This Is Portland video addresses BLM. But I think in terms of a destination that really does bring the entire community together across the public, private sectors, few do it as good as Portland. So he would be good, I think, to have a chat with.
Excellent. Well, hopefully you can connect us, and then we'll have him on the podcast. Thank you, Greg. It's been a pleasure, and I hope everybody listening enjoys this episode, and we hope to catch you again on the Event Manager podcast.
Good talking with you, Miguel, and Dylan. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Bye now.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Event Manager podcast. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. For the latest news and the best articles on technology and innovation in the event industry, head over to eventmb.com.